Well, so one of the temperamental differences between men and women is that difference in agreeableness, let's say. And so there's less of a tendency for overt conflict among women. Now, that doesn't mean there's less of a tendency for covert conflict. And actually, what you do see is that antisocial women, right, the ones who can't cooperate well and who can't work together in a team, they use underground strategies like reputation savaging and gossip to, what would you say, promulgate their aggressive behavior. Now, men are much more likely to do that up front, and there's some simplicity in that. But also women have a proclivity to experience more negative emotion than men. And so for each unit of stress, they manifest more psychophysiological response. That seems to kick in around puberty. And so that additional, you call it volatility is the technical term. That's an aspect of trait neuroticism, by the way. That volatility also, that increased volatility also makes it more difficult, arguably, for women to brush things off the same way that men who are cooperating in a team might. And I mean, the reason I'm talking about this, by the way, and delving into this is because we are going to get into the topic of sex and gender very soon, because, well, that's where we're headed, given that that's the root of the conflict that's made itself manifest around you. And so it's useful to establish and to start to explore the territory that's relevant with regard to sex differentiation. Now, obviously, when you were competing, you weren't competing in a co-ed situation.
Right.
It was women competing against women and men competing against men. And it's been set up like that for a long time. So given the claims in our society for radical equality, both in actuality and as a desirable outcome, first of all, do you think that there's what is, if any, the justification for not making all sporting events, let's say, radically co-ed?
Well, because I think we know how this would turn out. Time and time again, regardless of the sport, regardless of if it's an individual sport, a team sport, what that might look like. We've seen example after example where a mediocre male or a mediocre men's team, nowhere near ranking the top. Let's say this could be nationally, this could be whatever level you're comparing here. Unanimously, these men's teams, they dominate the women. So having a co-ed team, that would not be beneficial to women by any means. So I think that's why I believe there's value to having co-ed instructional teams when you're younger, when you're learning. But once you've gone through that puberty, it's irreversible. Men are, of course, on average, taller, faster, stronger, more powerful. They jump higher. There's so many different attributes, advantages that men have in comparison to women. And so I think co-ed teams, in a sense, if that's what you're looking for, of course, there's value to it. But at the competitive level where you're competing, again, to win, that's what your goal is. Having men compete against women is very obvious. It's unfair.
Okay, so let me push this. I'm going to push this as far as I can push it, because things are being pushed in our culture as far as they can be pushed. So we might as well go in for a penny and in for a pound. I could say, well, why don't we just scrap women's sports altogether? Like, if the goal is faster, stronger, better, more powerful, and on average, that's not happening in the female domain, why don't we just give up the entire enterprise on the female sports end and just let the men take over the playing field? If that's the point, if the point is to foster the highest possible level of performance. So to say that men are stronger, to say that men are faster, taller, whatever, that's not to say that women are inferior. That's not to say that we're not capable of amazing things and we're not strong and we're not, again, all of those words I previously mentioned, but we have different physical ceilings. I believe we deserve to be celebrated on our uniqueness. That's what makes the women's sporting category special. And there are still phenoms in women's sports, just like there are male sports. Look at Venus and Serena Williams. While by no means could they compete with the best male tennis player, they're phenomenal. They are
it's amazing what they've accomplished. They've set themselves apart from every other female in the world, and that deserves to be recognized. So to say we're different.
So let's delve into that. So because you might say, well, there's two reasons for high level competition, and let's say on the athletic front, one would be to extend the domain of what's possible in terms of performance and to model that for other people. And then you could make a case, you could make the case that the absolute records are the best example of that. So the fastest person in the world, the fastest swimmer in the world, and most of the time that's going to be men. But then you could make a more sophisticated case, which I believe is the proper case, that actually what you're doing as an athlete or as any expert in a competitive realm is modeling the ability to push the envelope and to further transform and develop. And unless you believe that that's less important for women, which is a preposterous thing to believe, then you have to believe that setting up a situation where women can push the envelope consistently in whatever directions they're pushing, you have to presume that that's a psychological good and a social good. And then you have to presume that the spaces where that can occur have to be protected. But that also opens a can of worms, doesn't it, Because since the 1960s in particular, we've blown off the barriers between men and women in terms of general participation in society, right? And so we've decided that all things considered, spaces isolated to a given sex are suboptimal, right? The schools are co-ed, the public schools, the universities are co-ed, all business enterprises are co-ed, so to speak. And then, of course, so that raises the question, well, should any domains be left sex segregated? If so, how do you walk the fine line between sex segregation for the purpose of facilitating development and sex segregation that turns into prejudice and oppression, right? Just rejection on the basis of sex. And then also the thorny question of, well, if most enterprises should be completely open to both sexes, which enterprises should be protected? Do you have any? Obviously, you believe that athletic performance, athletic competition per se, should be one of those protected categories. But do you have any sense of how we as a society should draw the line? It's like, are there spaces that should be male only? Like one of the things I really wonder about, for example, I talked to Tulsi Gabbard about this a while back, is like, it isn't obvious to me at all that our society would benefit by having women in frontline combat.
Right.